With new employees, and with a company policy that nobody was to be laid off in reaction to the Depression, the Ford company found itself with a lot of labor. There's even stories about parts that there were too many of because the company wanted to keep everyone working even if the part the production line produced wasn't needed. So the spare parts were piled up all around the factory. Ford employees called them welfare units, when Ford wasn't around to hear, of course. Another way the labor was put to use was in the thousands of acres of farmland Ford had bought up in Michigan. Between 7,000 and 8,000 acres were dedicated to soybeans alone. The plan for this was to use a synthetic material produced from the plants and put it in cars. This was a very expensive process, costing the company both production and $5 day labor. Although the plan would successfully produce plastic for use in automobiles, the company would discontinue the operation after Ford's death. This type of thing was completely in character for Ford's so-called 20-track mind. Ford would describe the operation as adding industry to farming, making it much more efficient than any farming that had been done before. The next public drama that Henry Ford got himself into was the 1932 presidential election. In this election, Ford made no secret that he thought better of Hoover's economic policy than FDR's. Despite that, many people blamed then-President Hoover for the start and lack of stop to the Great Depression. FDR was elected, and in 1933, less than a year into his first term, Ford's first big clash with Roosevelt's federal government began. It started with the signing into law of the NRA, the National Recovery Act. The act included labor standards that seemed fair, like a reasonable minimum wage, among other things, but also gave the president the ability to further manipulate some of the standards in the future. As a sign of compliance with fair labor standards, companies were expected by convention to put the Blue Eagle stamp on the products they sold. Ford, as you might guess, took issue. The labor standards weren't a problem for him. The Ford company had been exceeding the standards set in the bill for years already. The problem lied in the principle of government overstepping their rights and regulation of business, as well as a small footnote in the bill mandating companies to allow workers to unionize. Because of this, Ford refused to put the Blue Eagle stamp on his cars, a decision which newspapers predictably swarmed around. Enter Hugh Johnson, one of FDR's advisors appointed head of the National Recovery Administration. Johnson's first response to Ford was constant badgering. He called him on the phone multiple times to talk about the Blue Eagle stamp, and eventually went to Dearborn to meet Ford in his office. This meeting is something spectacular. They talked not explicitly about the stamp, but about the broad abstract goals of the NRA, among which was labor stimulation through increasing minimum wage and decreasing maximum amount of hours worked by each individual, making it so companies would have to hire more people and add shift changes to their workers' schedules for the same amount of production. Ford agreed that the points mentioned would indeed contribute to bringing the economy out of the toilet. This pleased Johnson, and he left the meeting satisfied. Reportedly, after leaving Dearborn, he was surprised to find that Ford still refused the stamp because he didn't want government overstretching its powers in business. Johnson was getting miffed at this, not only because Ford, one of the biggest names in the country, was openly making a joke of this bill, now signed into law, that Johnson believed would be the magical cure to the economic mess they found themselves in, but also because Ford's competitors were getting antsy, worried that Ford would rub salt in the wound by raising his minimum wage to something unsustainable for the third time in 20 years, thus making them look bad by comparison. As it happens, Ford did just that, and also made a commitment to hire 5,000 veterans at his factories. Johnson, around the same time, attempted to organize a boycott campaign against Ford because he didn't carry the fair labor stamp, even though his workers had better conditions than blue stamp companies. The newspapers and everyone reading them were just eating up this whole fiasco. Johnson and Roosevelt's next move here was an executive order stating that, because Ford refused the stamp, his company would no longer be allowed to win government contracts even if Ford was the lowest bidder, which he often was. Despite the media utterly blowing this one out of proportion, this hardly hurt Ford's business at all because government contracts were a very small percentage of his total business. After a few years, in 1935, the government relented on this executive order, and Ford followed it up once again by raising his minimum wage to $6 a day. In spring of that year, the NRA Act was nullified in a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court, resulting from a poultry company suing against one of the many regulations. Not Ford this time. As for the state of the company in the early 30s, they were slipping. While still one of the huge names in the auto industry, they were no longer the unquestioned kings of it. Chevrolet's production and sales had caught up to them, and even passed them. By the end of 1932, although the company still had more than $500 million in reserve, they faced a $72 million deficit that year. When asked about the deficit in an interview, Henry Ford replied, "We didn't lose the money, we spent it." Ford stubbornly pressed on with a plan to produce 1 million cars in 1935, which he successfully did at the cost of over $650 million. Ford's battle against unions continued as well, even through some strikes in 1933. Ford had always seen unions as anti-production, and unions were now seeing the Ford plants as one of the last few, and certainly the biggest, stronghold of anti-unionism in the country. They tried relentlessly to get their influence inside his factories. In 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act passed, his response was, "The Ford Company has had a Labor Relations Act for years. I would be ashamed to have anyone tell me our conditions and pay are wrong. That part of my job was started 20 years ago. I have heard no complaints from our men. There is nothing a union can give them that they haven't already got. I haven't given the Wagner Act a thought. We've always had it in force." Ford was surprisingly healthy and fit in 1933, at the age of 70. He had operations for appendicitis and for a hernia, but recovered fast and was described to have had an agile body and a quick mind. His health at that age is credited to daily exercise, the exercise consisting of a walk or sprint through a nearby park. Ford also said of his diet that he eats only when he's hungry, rather than waiting for conventional mealtimes. He believed that when his belly was empty, he could think more clearly because the blood was in his head rather than in his stomach. By 1940, Ford was the last big auto manufacturer whose company was not unionized. Unions scored a victory in October of that year when the city of Dearborn gave them permission to stand outside the River Rouge plant at shift change time and distribute pamphlets to workers. This happened as a result of a circuit judge ruling that the ordinance against handbills was unconstitutional, something which was appealed by both the Ford Company and the city of Dearborn, unsuccessfully. The unions wasted no time in getting people out there to hand union reading material to everyone at shift change. There was one instance in particular where the situation escalated and a group of union members got into a physical confrontation with some Ford Company guards after being ordered off a bridge whose use was restricted to Ford Company workers. As a result of some big news reporters getting injured in this scuffle, the small event got a large amount of press attention. Harry Bennett, still the director of labor relations at Ford's company, was a central figure in criticism against Ford. Following news of this, the National Labor Relations Board ordered the Ford Company to stop prohibiting union membership, stop using company guards to intimidate employees, and to rehire all previous employees who had been fired for union membership. Ford Company, of course, given confidence by their successful defiance of the NRA, defied this as well. After the Supreme Court in February 1941 refused to review the ruling of the NLRB, however, the Ford Company agreed to stop prohibiting union membership. Inside the plant, this made things more tense than they had ever been before. Inside the plant, one could instantly start seeing employees wearing union pins, something which would have been unthinkable a short time earlier. Representatives of the union would go to Ford management and ask them to address any one of the worker grievances that had built up over the past decades. They were dealt with as often as not. Workers and unions at this point were operating with the silent knowledge that Ford was probably in violation of a number of small, uncared-about regulations. And with that leverage, they pushed for workers' rights inside the factory. Bennett fought back against this as efficiently as he could. He would find excuses to fire problem workers on the rare occasion that he could. He would move union representatives around to different work departments so that they could never get too familiar with those they represent in their own department. It was a continuous game of push and shove, with Ford ever so slowly losing ground. The situation escalated to departments of a few dozen people each having regular sit-down strikes to oppose the firing of their co-workers and other grievances. A quote from Ford about his attitude towards the union: "We will bargain with it because the law says so. We will bargain until hell freezes over, but they won't get anything." This continued until April of 1941. That was the start date of one of the biggest union strikes against Ford, and it happened in response to the unfair firing of 8 union representatives within the company. Not just any 8 either. These 8 were some of the highest-ranking union members in the Ford Company, and their termination meant a severe hindrance of the union's ability to organize within the plant. Bennett knew that this would result in a large-scale strike, but that was the point. He wanted to force the hand of the union and fight the fight on Ford's terms, not the union's. They knew that they would lose to the union if things continued in the way they were, so they wanted to give them an ultimatum. If they didn't strike after the 8 workers were fired, they would lose momentum and leverage. If they did, they would risk bad PR and government intervention in Ford's favor. That was the game they were playing. The unions, in response to this, put together a large organized sit-down strike in Ford's factories in April. In all, 85,000 workers in multiple factory buildings were prevented from entering their place of work by strikers, who had set up during the night shift a perimeter around the entire complex. Their demands were the rehire of the 8 that were fired, and the holding of an election that all Ford employees would vote in to determine whether or not union membership at the Ford Company would be mandatory, and if so, which union would look after all the employees. The first day of the strike went exactly how the unionists wanted it to go. Workers for the morning shift would attempt to get to the factory, and if they refused to abandon their job, they would be pulled from their cars and beat bloody. This lasted for 99 days with no interference from the government despite a plea from Bennett sent directly to President Roosevelt, and no ability on Ford's part to put together an effective strike-breaking action, despite the common belief that the company had a secret underground chamber filled with weapons, tear gas, and strike-breaking equipment controlled by an army of ex-convict pro-Ford thugs. The Ford Company's response to this was one they had been planning all along. They would ask the government for help. They would ask for police intervention, and they would ask the governor of the state and the federal government to mobilize National Guard to deal with the strikes. The thing they needed before this, though, was justification for intervention. They knew that the government wanted to keep domestic peace and prevent interference with the shipping of military equipment abroad, part of the Lend-Lease deal. If you want to know more about that, check out the video about it from this awesome channel. Because they wanted to hit on the halt to war production, the Ford Company spread the rumor that the strikers had not only stopped production, but were destroying equipment inside the factory, something that would cost time and money to repair. The truth was that production was stopped and nothing more. The strikers weren't even in the factory. The inside of the factory was controlled by a group of over 1,000 African Americans that Bennett had hired and brought up from out of state. Ford and Bennett would have the press believe that this group of African Americans were normal workers in the factory, loyal to Ford. Production narrative spun, they now needed evidence of chaos and violence among the strikers, something which, apart from stopping cars from entering the factory, the strikers weren't giving. They were as peaceful as could be expected because the union knew that if they were to win this strike, they needed to keep the moral high ground at all costs. Bennett tried to incite violence and rioting among the strikers a couple different ways, mainly by having the people inside the factory hurl bricks and other things down at the strikers from atop walls and rooftops. Some of the strikers hurled the bricks right back up at them, but apart from that, peace was kept. In fact, the strikers actually brought in the head of the NAACP at one point, who gave a speech through a loudspeaker which inspired a few hundred of the people in the factory to leave the area and abandon Bennett. Enough of them stayed, though. The strike was in this shape when Bennett wired a message to President FDR himself, asking for the government to intervene in the strike and describing a scene of chaos that the criminal terrorists were causing both inside the factory and out. The Ford Company made sure great publicity was made of this. The union, of course, knowing that the strike was more peaceful than not, and knowing their strikers did not have access to the inside of the building, publicly and loudly made their side of the story heard. The government did not intervene. With that lack of action, all the leverage was taken away from Ford, and since he didn't have the physical means to break the strike without causing a huge mess and multiple deaths, he was checkmated. Completely defeated, Ford was forced to offer extremely generous terms to striking workers and protesters in order to get his factory back. He agreed to allow them to have their election and to rehire 5 of the 8 original workers that were fired.